The Epsilon was a ship like no other built by the greatest minds of the Galactic Federation. It was an advanced warship capable of the most extraordinary feats. The technology was cutting edge, the hull reinforced with alien alloys, the engines powered by quantum reactors, and the weapon systems designed to obliterate any foe in its path. Yet, when it took to its first real mission, it proved to be nothing more than a colossal disappointment. The mission was supposed to be a routine patrol across the outskirts of the Federation-controlled space, a simple task to scout for pirate activity and ensure peacekeeping forces were present in the area, a task that would be nothing for a ship as powerful as the Epsilon. But from the moment they engaged with the hostile fleet, things began to unravel. The Epsilon's weapon systems failed to activate properly, the energy shields flickered on and off like a dying star, and the ship's engines sputtered as if it were an ancient relic rather than the marvel of galactic engineering it was supposed to be. Captain Carla Jensen stood at the command console, her eyes scanning the tactical displays, her fingers flying across the controls trying to stabilize the ship. But no matter how hard she tried, nothing seemed to work. Each command she gave was met with failure. The enemy ships, a small but aggressive pirate faction, moved around them with ease, launching their attacks without mercy. The Epsilon tried to retaliate, but the blasts from its weapons were weak and unfocused, not at all what they should have been. In fact, the ship barely had enough power to fire back, and when it did, it missed the mark. The crew worked frantically trying to patch up the systems in real time, but nothing could bring the Epsilon to its full potential, at least not in this battle. The ship was slow, the weapons ineffective, and the crew had no choice but to retreat. They barely escaped with their lives, and as they jumped into warp space, leaving the pirate fleet behind them, Carla couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something deeper than a mere technical glitch. In the aftermath of the mission, the Federation leaders were not pleased. They had expected the Epsilon to be a symbol of their might, a ship that could lead them into the future, but instead it was a failure, and the blame fell on everyone who had a hand in its creation: the engineers, the alien species that designed the systems, and even the crew members who operated the ship. It was hard not to feel the weight of their collective disappointment pressing down on them. Captain Jensen walked off the bridge that day with a grim expression on her face. She knew the truth. No one else was willing to admit it. The Epsilon was not ready for the galaxy. It was far too weak, too flawed, and without drastic changes it would never stand a chance in battle. As she walked to her quarters, Carla overheard the whispers of her crew members, who shared the same sense of disillusionment in their hearts. They knew it too. The Epsilon could not continue to operate like this, and unless something drastic happened, it would be nothing more than a floating failure. The question now was who would take the first step to fix it. Would anyone dare to challenge the established order and admit the truth, or would they simply move on and pretend it never happened? The answer would not come easily, but Carla and her human crew knew that if the Epsilon was to survive, it would take more than just alien technology. It would take something humanity had: an abundance of determination, creativity, and the will to make the impossible happen. The days following the disastrous mission were tense aboard the Epsilon. The alien officers and crew members were focused on repairing the ship and reviewing what had gone wrong. Yet their efforts seemed futile. The systems were far too complex for the solutions they proposed. They kept returning to the same conclusions: the Epsilon was flawed, the technology was too advanced to work properly, or perhaps it had never been meant for this kind of warfare at all. Captain Carla Jensen could see it in their eyes. They were ready to accept defeat. They had lost hope, and with it any desire to make the ship more than what it had been. But Carla refused to let it go. The Epsilon was not a failure. She knew that deep down it had potential. There had to be a way to make it work. There had to be a way to fix its problems and make it stronger. She had seen the power in human ingenuity before, and she knew it could work on a ship like this. Gathering her small human crew in secret, Carla shared her thoughts with them. The ship could be repaired, but not with the methods they were using now, not with the same alien technology that had been designed to fit their ideas of what a ship should be. Carla was convinced that the Epsilon needed a new approach. She couldn't rely on the same engineering principles that had created its failures in the first place. Her crew listened intently, the humans among them weren't experts in alien technology, but they had something the others didn't. They had an innate ability to think outside the box, to look at a problem from a different angle. They knew how to innovate on the fly, and it was that kind of thinking that had gotten them this far in the first place. They had no choice now but to act quickly and decisively if they were going to survive the next mission, and if they were going to make the Epsilon a true powerhouse, they would need to start with small changes that would lead to bigger breakthroughs. Quietly, they began working on the ship's systems late at night, in hidden workshops and isolated corridors. They began rewiring components, testing new configurations, and working with alien engineers who were willing to listen to their ideas. The humans weren't trying to completely reinvent the ship, they just needed to push it past its limitations. The power systems needed to be optimized, the weapon systems needed to be more than just precision tools. They needed brute force and adaptability. The human crew was determined to make the ship not just survive but thrive. In those early days, no one except the humans believed it was possible. The alien engineers looked at them with skepticism at best. Some even laughed at the humans' ideas. Some tried to discourage them by suggesting that their modifications would only cause more problems. But Carla and her team pressed on. They didn't have the luxury of time, and they didn't have the luxury of doubt. They had to make it work, or they would all be left defenseless in the face of the unknown. With each passing day, the humans grew more confident as their modifications took shape. The Epsilon began to show signs of improvement. The power core hummed more smoothly, the weapon systems responded with greater force and precision, and the once sluggish engines now had a level of responsiveness they had never known before. It wasn't perfect, not yet, but the Epsilon was starting to feel like something different, something more than just a ship. It was starting to feel like a weapon capable of turning the tide in any battle. And as the human crew looked at the progress they had made in secret, they knew one thing for sure: the Epsilon was on the verge of becoming something far greater than anyone had ever imagined. It was no longer a powerless ship, it was a work in progress, and they would be the ones to make it invincible. The humans had been working in secret for weeks, each day bringing new challenges and new successes. The ship's power core was one of the first systems they tackled with their hands and minds. They rewired parts of it to harness energy more efficiently, and soon it began to hum with a steady, powerful pulse. The once unstable energy source now thrummed with potential. The shields that had failed them so spectacularly during their first engagement now glowed with a steady blue light that held its ground against even the most intense tests. The Epsilon was slowly coming alive once more, and each human on board knew they were part of something that was far greater than anything they had ever imagined. Captain Carla Jensen stood on the bridge as the engineers made final adjustments to the weapons systems. Her heart beat faster as the ship powered up. She had always known that human innovation could overcome any challenge, but now she saw it firsthand. The Epsilon was becoming the ship it was always meant to be, the weapon they needed to defend the galaxy from the threats that loomed on the horizon. As the final calibrations were made to the ship's main guns, Carla stood beside her chief engineer, Lieutenant Olivia Park, a quiet but brilliant mind who had been instrumental in reworking the weapon systems. The original design was good, but it was too focused on precision strikes. It needed power force, a punch to match the strength of any foe that came their way. Park looked at Carla with a nod of approval, and with that the weapon systems were ready for testing. Carla turned to the tactical officer, Lieutenant Marco Alvarez, who had been overseeing the ship's overall systems. With a mix of caution and anticipation, Alvarez had been skeptical of their plans at first, but now he was fully on board. His eyes met hers, and with a simple command he ordered the first full test of the Epsilon's new capabilities. The ship's weapons unleashed with a roar as they fired at a nearby asteroid. The blast was immense, a shockwave rippling through space. The asteroid shattered into 1,000 pieces, and the Epsilon's crew watched in awe as the power of the weapon systems finally lived up to their expectations. It was only a test, but it was a success. The ship had come alive, and for the first time since its creation, the crew felt the power in their hands. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting to show the galaxy that humanity could do what no one else could accomplish. The changes to the Epsilon weren't done yet. There was still work to be done to perfect the ship and make sure everything worked in harmony, but that first success felt like a victory in itself. It was a moment to remember, a moment that would set the stage for what was to come. Carla and her crew knew that they were no longer the underdogs. They had taken something broken and made it stronger, and with every success, they would prove that humanity was capable of achieving greatness, even when the odds were against them. As the crew celebrated their success quietly in the corridors of the ship, Carla couldn't help but smile to herself. This wasn't just about the Epsilon anymore. It was about the potential of humanity itself. They had only just begun, and already they had made something the Federation had thought impossible. They had turned a powerless ship into a force to be reckoned with, and with the galaxy watching, they were ready for whatever came next. Just as the crew began to revel in their success, the news came: the Federation had detected a new threat, an alien force unlike any the galaxy had seen before. The Vrex, a massive and fearsome race of warlords known for their devastating firepower and nearly indestructible ships. They had begun to invade Federation space, and the Federation's fleets were struggling to hold them off. Reports came in from all corners of the galaxy detailing the destruction of entire colonies. Their ships were too powerful, their weapons too advanced, and the Federation's forces were being pushed back on all fronts. Captain Carla Jensen stood on the bridge of the Epsilon as she received the transmission from Federation Command. Their voices filled with urgency and fear. The situation was dire. The Vrex were heading toward a strategically important system, and unless the Federation could mount a defense, the entire sector would fall into their hands. The Epsilon was the only ship in the area with the ability to respond, and though it was not yet fully repaired, Federation Command had no other option. They needed the Epsilon, and they needed it now. The decision was made quickly. The Epsilon would be the first line of defense against the Vrex invasion. The crew didn't have much time to prepare, but they were ready. Carla turned to her officers with a determined look in her eyes. She knew this was the moment they had been working toward. This was their chance to prove that the Epsilon was more than just a ship. It was a weapon and humanity's contribution to the galaxy's future. Lieutenant Olivia Park was the first to speak, breaking the tense silence. "We've done everything we can, Captain. The ship is as ready as it can be." Carla nodded. There was no time for doubt. They would have to rely on their instincts and their new modifications to get them through this battle. Marco Alvarez spoke up next. "We've got a rough road ahead, Captain. The Vrex are ruthless. They won't hesitate to tear us apart. But I think we've got a shot." Carla gave him a determined smile. "I know we do," she said. "The Epsilon has something no one else has: human ingenuity. We're not just going to survive, we're going to win." The ship jumped into hyperspace, and the crew fell into their battle stations. The mood was serious, but there was also a quiet confidence in the air. They had faced challenges before, and they had always come out stronger. They had taken a ship that was once powerless and turned it into something capable of facing even the most terrifying of foes. Now, they were about to prove their worth to the galaxy. As they neared the Vrex fleet, the tension on the ship was palpable. Every officer was on edge. Every crew member knew that this could be their last mission, and yet there was no fear in their hearts, only the fierce resolve to fight and to win. The Epsilon was ready, and with humanity's mark on it, it was now more than just a ship. It was a beacon of hope for all who believed in the impossible. The Vrex fleet appeared on the horizon, a massive armada of ships that seemed invincible, yet the Epsilon stood firm, its weapons charged, its shields strong, and its crew ready to fight for their lives and the future of the Federation. The battle would begin soon, and the crew of the Epsilon knew that the time for proving their worth had arrived. The Epsilon emerged from hyperspace into the heart of the battle. The sheer scale of the Vrex fleet was staggering. Thousands of ships looming like dark shadows in the void, their weapon systems already lighting up as they began their assault on the Federation's defenses. The Epsilon was not the only ship present, but it was the only one with any hope of standing up to the Vrex. The rest of the Federation fleet had already taken heavy losses, and the remaining ships were scattered and disorganized. Captain Carla Jensen stood firm at the helm of the Epsilon, watching as the chaos unfolded around them. The ship was still not perfect despite all their hard work, but it had become something more than they could have imagined. It was alive with energy, the hum of its newly optimized power core filled the air. The weapons systems were ready to strike, and the crew stood prepared for whatever came their way. Yet as the Epsilon moved closer to the Vrex fleet, a cold realization swept over Carla. They were outnumbered and outgunned. There was no way they could take on such a massive force in a direct confrontation. It was Marco Alvarez who first saw it, a subtle but critical flaw in the Vrex strategy. The ships were powerful, yes, but they were relying on a predictable pattern in their attack formations. It was the same tactic they used in every battle, a brute force approach that left them vulnerable. If only someone could exploit that weakness, the Epsilon could survive. But how? As the enemy ships closed in, Carla took a deep breath and issued a command that would change everything. All ships break formation and scatter. We're not fighting them head-on. We're going to use their own strategy against them. The crew reacted quickly and efficiently. The Epsilon veered sharply to the side, narrowly avoiding a barrage of enemy fire. The Vrex ships followed suit, unaware of the human crew's plan. For the first time in the battle, the Epsilon's crew was in control. They had shifted the tide by simply refusing to fight on the Vrex terms. Carla had learned something in that moment, something critical. Human creativity could see opportunities where others saw only obstacles. The Epsilon was not just another weapon, it was an extension of that very creativity. Now they could turn the tide. Lieutenant Olivia Park had been working frantically on recalibrating the Epsilon's weapon systems. She had realized that they could use the ship's mobility to create more powerful, focused shots instead of firing indiscriminately. They would use the ship's agility and reposition themselves to strike at key targets when the Vrex didn't expect it. The first successful shot was a game-changer. A single shot from the Epsilon's cannons hit the vulnerable underside of a massive Vrex battleship. The resulting explosion sent shockwaves through the surrounding ships, and the fleet briefly faltered, their precision and coordination slipping as their attention shifted to the Epsilon. Captain Carla Jensen could feel the shift in the air as the Epsilon's crew worked together. With laser focus, each move was calculated and deliberate as the ship weaved in and out of the battle zone, striking at vulnerabilities in the Vrex fleet that no one else had seen. Their strategy was simple yet effective. They weren't just fighting to survive, they were outsmarting their enemies at every turn. As the battle raged on, the Vrex fleet began to lose cohesion. Their ships started to fall back. One by one, the Federation's forces, though battered, began to regroup, taking advantage of the confusion to strike back. But the real victory was being won by the Epsilon and its crew. The impossible had become possible, and humanity had found a way to turn the tables. Carla stood tall, her eyes fixed on the battlefield. Before her, the Epsilon was no longer just a ship, it was a force of nature, and as the tide of battle shifted in their favor, she couldn't help but feel the weight of their triumph. Humanity had just shown the galaxy that they could accomplish what no one else could. The Epsilon had taken the initiative, and the tide of battle shifted, but the Vrex were not to be underestimated. Their arrogance had been their first mistake, and now the humans had shown them just how dangerous they could be with strategy and ingenuity. The Vrex were furious, and they regrouped faster than anyone anticipated. Captain Carla Jensen watched the battle unfold with a sharp focus. The Epsilon had created chaos within the Vrex lines, but now their enemies were adapting. The massive ships began to split apart, moving in unpredictable patterns. They were using tactics they hadn't before, trying to corner the Epsilon and overwhelm it with sheer numbers. Lieutenant Marco Alvarez's voice cut through the tension on the bridge. "They're changing tactics, Captain. They're starting to surround us, and the rest of the Federation fleet can't hold them off for long." Carla knew what that meant. They had made their mark. But now the true challenge began. It was no longer just about outmaneuvering the Vrex, it was about surviving their relentless assault. Olivia Park worked furiously at the weapons console, recalibrating the Epsilon systems again. She knew the ship could take more hits now, but their chances were slim if they didn't act fast. "We need to make another opening. We can't just keep dodging them." Carla glanced at the tactical map, her mind racing. The Epsilon's agility had been its saving grace, but it couldn't dodge forever. They needed to strike decisively. In the midst of the chaos, Captain Jensen saw it. The Vrex had created a weak point in their formation. Their flagship, a massive, imposing vessel at the center of the fleet, had a gap in its defenses, a chance to hit it hard and take down their leader. This was the opening they needed, but it would take everything they had. Carla turned to her crew and gave a simple command: full speed ahead, target the flagship and fire with everything. "We've got the Epsilon," roared to life, as it surged forward, using the momentum of the battle to catapult itself toward the Vrex flagship. "Shields up, weapons ready, we're going in." The enemy ships tried to react, but the Epsilon was faster. It darted in and out of their firing range, avoiding blast after blast. As they closed the distance, the crew held their breath as they neared the flagship. This was their one shot, and they had to make it count. Lieutenant Olivia Park activated the weapon systems, and the Epsilon's main cannon charged up its energy, crackling through the ship's circuits as it powered up. Park locked in the target. The massive Vrex ship loomed in front of them, an impenetrable fortress of armor and weaponry. But this time the Epsilon wasn't relying on sheer firepower. It was relying on precision and the calculations they had perfected over the past weeks. With a deafening roar, the Epsilon's main cannon fired. The blast was unlike anything the crew had seen before. It tore through space with a blinding flash and struck the weak point of the Vrex flagship. With surgical precision, the ship rocked as the shot hit its mark. The force of the explosion sent shockwaves throughout the battle. The flagship was not destroyed, but it was crippled, its shields failing, its engines sparking, and its weapon systems flickering. The Vrex fleet faltered as their command ship was compromised. The Epsilon had done it. They had created the opening they needed. As the enemy forces struggled to regroup, the Federation fleet rallied behind them, launching a renewed offensive. Carla knew the battle wasn't over yet, but the balance had shifted, and for the first time since the war began, she felt a spark of hope in her chest. The Epsilon had proven that it was not just a ship. It was the beginning of something bigger. The humans had shown that they could think on their feet, that they could defy the odds, and that they could win when everything seemed lost. But as the battle raged on, Carla knew that the Vrex were not finished yet. They would not let this defeat slide easily. They would come back stronger and more determined than ever, and the crew of the Epsilon would have to be ready. The Vrex fleet had been shaken, but not defeated. Their flagship was crippled, but still operational, and their forces were furious with a vengeance. Unlike anything the humans had seen before, the Vrex regrouped quickly despite the blow to their command ship, and they began to adapt their tactics in real time. Captain Carla Jensen knew that the next wave would come with relentless fury. They had created an opening, but the Vrex were far from finished. This wasn't just about defeating a few ships anymore. This was about surviving the wrath of an empire built on domination and power. The Epsilon had done well, but the war had only just begun. Lieutenant Marco Alvarez looked over at Carla from his station. "We've got incoming, Captain. Multiple Vrex ships are locking onto us. They shifted their formation to trap us in a pincer move." Carla's mind raced. She knew the Epsilon was fast, but not fast enough to escape the sheer numbers of the Vrex fleet. She turned to Olivia Park, who was already working on the weapon systems. "What's the status, Lieutenant? We need a way out." Park didn't look up from her console. "They're coming in fast, Captain. I'm making some adjustments to the main engines, but it's going to take a few moments." The Epsilon was quick, but not invincible. They couldn't afford to wait and see if their enemy would give them the chance to escape. The crew braced themselves as the Vrex ships began to close in, their massive guns targeting the Epsilon with deadly intent. Carla gritted her teeth and issued the only command she could think of: "Don't fight them head-on. Get us through their lines. Evade at all costs." The Epsilon veered sharply to the side, dodging the incoming blasts with impressive agility. But the Vrex ships were closing in fast, and their weapons were far more powerful than anything they had faced so far. Each shot that hit the Epsilon rattled the crew, sending shockwaves through the ship and shaking the very foundation of their hope. But the Epsilon held steady, its new systems holding firm. Even under the pressure, they had made it through worse together, and Carla knew they could survive this too. As the Epsilon danced between the blasts, Carla's thoughts turned to the crew. They had come so far, but they were still outnumbered and outgunned. They couldn't keep this up forever. If they didn't find a way to strike back soon, they would be overwhelmed. Then Marco spoke again. "Captain, the Vrex flagship is trying to move away from the rest of the fleet. It looks like they're trying to reposition themselves to flank us." Carla's eyes widened. She knew the Vrex would do whatever it took to gain the upper hand, and if they were allowed to flank the Epsilon, the entire battle would be lost without hesitation. She turned to Olivia Park. "We need to hit that flagship now while it's isolated. It's our best chance at ending this quickly." Park's fingers flew over the controls, rerouting power to the main weapons and recalibrating the targeting systems with a focus Carla had never seen before. "Ready when you are, Captain." Carla gave the order, and the Epsilon surged forward, once again weaving through the incoming fire from the Vrex fleet. As the flagship came into view, the Epsilon's main cannon charged up. A single shot was all they had, but if it hit the flagship now, it could destroy their command structure and send the rest of the fleet into disarray. With a mighty roar, the Epsilon's weapon fired. The blast tore through space with unrelenting force and struck the Vrex flagship head-on. The ship's shields flickered, but the blast was too powerful, and the flagship erupted in a massive explosion that sent shockwaves across the battlefield. The Vrex fleet faltered as their command ship was lost, and their ships began to lose coordination. The Epsilon had done it. They had struck the heart of the enemy fleet and caused chaos within their ranks. But Carla knew that this victory was just a momentary triumph. The Vrex would come back with greater force, and if they didn't prepare for what was next, the Epsilon and its crew would not survive the coming storm. The Vrex fleet was in disarray, their flagship destroyed, their forces scattered, and their pride wounded. But they were not a species to be taken lightly. They would regroup, and they would come back with everything they had left. Captain Carla Jensen knew this, and with each passing moment, the weight of their victory began to feel more like a ticking clock. The Epsilon had struck a decisive blow, but the Vrex were far from finished, and the battle was far from over. The crew of the Epsilon had fought bravely. They had pushed themselves beyond the limits of what they thought possible, but now the stakes were higher than ever. The Federation fleet had taken heavy losses, and the rest of their ships were scattered far from the front lines. The Epsilon had become their last hope, their last defense against the Vrex, and they couldn't afford to fail. Lieutenant Olivia Park stood at the weapons console, her hands flying over the controls. The Epsilon was ready, its weapon systems primed, its shields reinforced, but the enemy was reorganizing, and the incoming waves of Vrex ships were already beginning to form up once again. They would come at them with everything they had, but this time the Epsilon wouldn't be dodging or weaving. They would face the full force of the Vrex head-on. Carla looked over at her crew, her eyes filled with determination. They had survived so far through every challenge and every test of their resolve. They had proven that humanity could overcome any obstacle, and now it was time to finish what they started. They would make their stand, and they would make it count. "All hands prepare for battle." She called out. The ship's crew moved with precision as they manned their stations, each officer knowing their role and performing it flawlessly. Carla's heart pounded in her chest as she gave the order to engage the Vrex fleet for the final time. The Epsilon surged forward once again, this time straight into the heart of the Vrex formation. Their ships loomed large in the distance, and the familiar crackle of incoming fire filled the air. But the Epsilon didn't falter. It held its course, and with a thunderous roar, the first volley of weapons fire was unleashed. The enemy ships tried to react, but the Epsilon's crew was already ahead of them. With the improved systems and new strategies they had developed, they struck hard and fast, taking down enemy ships with pinpoint accuracy. The Vrex had been overconfident, but now they were facing a threat they hadn't anticipated, a human crew that refused to back down. It wasn't just a fight for survival anymore. It was a fight for everything they had worked for, a fight for the future of humanity in the galaxy, and they would not let the Vrex take that from them. As the battle raged on, the Epsilon danced between the enemy ships, its weapons cutting down foes one by one, while the crew held firm at their stations. Carla's mind raced as she watched the battlefield unfold. They were winning, but they couldn't afford to let their guard down. The Vrex were ruthless and would stop at nothing to ensure their victory. With one final push, the Epsilon's weapons fired in unison, a blast of energy that ripped through the Vrex forces and shattered their lines. The remaining ships began to retreat, their morale shattered, and their ability to regroup lost. The Epsilon had done it. They had won. The Vrex were defeated, and the galaxy was safe for now. But Captain Carla Jensen knew that this victory wasn't just about defeating the Frex. It was about proving that humanity had a place in the galaxy, that their ingenuity and spirit could overcome any enemy, no matter how powerful or insurmountable. As the Epsilon drifted through the quiet of space, after the battle, Carla allowed herself a moment to breathe. The crew had done the impossible, and in doing so had shown the galaxy what humanity was capable of. The Epsilon was no longer a powerless ship. It was a symbol of hope, a reminder that no matter how dark the galaxy might seem, the light of humanity's determination would always shine through.